I will not be so presumptive as to say anything in this intro other than, wow. I admittedly had no idea I would get the positive response I had from that first video. I really didn't. In fact, the lack of negative response thus far has been genuinely surprising. No offense to my viewers, of course, but, well, let's just say that I don't really think of myself as having popular views about things such as Star Wars. So, here we are, episode 2, and I'm only like a page through it. I'm like, wow, this is not really much to talk about, and then not really much to talk about, and then... Yeah, I actually have more pages of notes this time. So hopefully this won't be another 2.5 hour thing. As ever, I'm not really timing it. It's just when I'm done, I'm done. A couple notes before we really get started. There's no denying that if you asked me prior to rewatching them here... Well, actually, let me rewind a little bit. For those of you who don't know, it's actually been a long time since I've really watched the Star Wars sectology, I guess. The Star Wars movies. I did a brief run-through of A New Hope earlier this year. I'll actually talk about that when we get to that, because it's significant for the purposes of one of the reasons why I'm doing this series, and agreed to do this series. But, the point being that, well, there's no nice way to put this, but, one of the reasons I hadn't watched them in so long, in so many years, is because I didn't really feel the desire to watch the prequels again. Now, I usually defend the prequels more than most people, actually. In fact, in the time when these movies actually came out, I found myself defending them more than I otherwise would, primarily because of the fact that I got tired of people bashing them in ways that were basically, well, there's no nice way to put this, a shrieking chorus. I heard very, very few legitimate complaints against the movies, and instead just, oh, it sucks, oh, it's bad, oh, it's terrible. You know, and there's nothing to be gained from that. There's nothing even to be improved upon from that when you think about it, because all you're doing is saying it's bad without why, and so there's no possibility to change, adapt, adjust. But the reason I bring this up here is if you asked me, you know, a week ago or whenever prior to me rewatching these episodes, I would say that episode 2, The Attack of the Dumb Name, would be without question my least favorite of the 6. Here's the weird thing. Being re-asked that question has become much harder for me to answer. Having just rewatched episode 1 not very long ago, just a couple days ago for that video, and having just rewatched episode 2 today, you know, I just finished it like, looks like about 12 minutes ago, give or take, and then, you know, got in costume and whatnot. I'm not sure anymore, because here's the bizarre thing. One of the things I noted in my Voyager videos, forgive me for plugging another feature on my show, is there are certain episodes that I automatically skip when I'm going through Voyager, and I mean, I didn't skip them for the videos, for the Ruminations, but normally when I'm just rewatching Voyager, or any series really, there's episodes that I just automatically skip. Most of the time, that's because those episodes are, what's the word? Bad! Yeah, because those episodes are bad. Threshold and Q in the Gray both come to mind. But there's another episode on that list, and it's called Alliances. It's a Season 2 episode. Forgive me for repeating, but I'm assuming the vast majority of my audience has not seen my video on Alliances. But to summarize, as I was rewatching it, I was surprised by how much I was enjoying it. And I was just confused. This is an episode I habitually skip. An episode that in my memory is one I fit with bile and irritation and aggravation. Why do I always skip this episode? And then I got to the scene, which, you know, it does. If you're not a Star Trek fan or Voyager fan, it doesn't matter. But there's a scene that happens that just destroys the entire rest of the episode. All the other good things that have been done, all the other positives are just annihilated because I am left with this horrible, terrible bile in my mouth because of this last scene, which just destroys all of that goodwill. To use this as an analogy, this only works... Actually, this will work for women as well, but it works for men a little bit more, I would say. Let's say that you've encountered someone who you've been close friends with for forever, and who are romantic, and you're romantically entangled with this person, and they get up close to you, and they're soft and gentle and kind, and everything it is you want, and they're talking about how wonderful everything's going to be, and we're going to be together, and let's go get a movie, and then let's go snuggle under the covers, you know, all this fun, wonderful stuff. It's all positives, right? And then, without any warning at all, they knee you in the bollocks. Or, if you're female, in the general region of the genitalia. Yes, I know that hurts just as much for a woman. I'm just getting the point across. This is why this point is significant. It's also one of the things that was brought up during the Mass Effect 3 debacle. If the rest of your work is good and one thing is atrociously bad, generally speaking, most people are going to remember the atrociously bad because that's when you need them in the bollocks. That's when you decided to go ahead and destroy all the goodwill you had created and actively go in so far as to going into the net negative. That's what Alliances did. The rest of the episode didn't matter because it was all the goodwill, all the beneficial there was destroyed by how bad that negative was, right? You can probably see how this ties into episode 2. I'm rewatching this episode, I'm rewatching this movie, I should say, going through it, and enjoying myself. And I'm just confused. What the hell? And I'm genuinely enjoying my retake through the movie, and I'm enjoying the dynamic between Obi-Wan and Anakin, and the effects have clearly improved, and the directing style is clearly improved. And then it became obvious why I disliked this movie. I'll go ahead and talk about specifics later, but suffice it to say, Episode 1 is a unique movie for me because the good that it did better than Episode 1 did. But the bad that it did much worse than Episode 1 did. And so, whether or not this movie or Episode 1 is my least favorite of the 6, has suddenly become a much bigger question for me. Because, again, it's like, this is great, this is wonderful. Oh, what is this? Oh, God. Now, I used an extreme example to get across the point, especially in the Mass Effect 3 parallel. But if you asked me, if gun to the head question, I'd probably go ahead and put Episode 1 as my least favorite now. And I know that's going to be a controversial choice. But I'll try and talk about why that is as we go through here. Next thing I want to mention here really quick. Let's just talk about this because this is a good segue. The overall pacing of the scenes and the general direction of most of the scenes is generally better in this episode than it was in Episode 1. It's pretty clear that they'd found their footing. The CGI and standard effects departments had figured out what they were doing. The editing team was better. A lot of team, Episode 1 felt like it was just kind of start, go from the scenes, like it wasn't, there was no smoothness to its pacing. As I've talked before, pacing is all about the smoothness of the pattern. The pattern itself, whether you do this, or whether you do this, or even if you just do a steady climb or a steady fall, it doesn't matter. It is the smoothness of the pacing that determines what good pacing is when it comes to a movie or video game or a book or show or whatever. And Episode 1 felt like, there was no smoothness to it. Episode 2, by contrast, smoothed much more properly. In addition to that, the writing in most character interactions, Natch, was overall better done than it was in Episode 1. Overall. There are some notable exceptions. We'll get to those later. I also have to talk about the title. Why call it Attack of the Clones? Why? I mean, that just sounds so ridiculous on the face of it. The argument has been made that all the Star Wars have ridiculous titles. I personally disagree. But even if that argument is being levied, the point has to be made that all the other 5 Star Trek movies have something to do with the overall theme of the piece and have significance within the piece. Phantom Menace, obvious, the Phantom Menace being Palpatine and his slow rise to power. And of course you could also infer that the Phantom Menace in this case is the overall corruption and degradation of the Senate and the Republic as a whole that led to that cultural stagnation that Palpatine took advantage of to begin with. So yeah, I'm with it. Revenge of the Sith, again, damned obvious, and also very significant considering it's not just the revenge of Palpatine himself for certain significance of facts, I'll talk about that in Episode 3, but also the fact that the Sith, as an overall organization, is able to make its first real comeback on a wide scale since Bane's time, arguably even before that, actually, because Bane didn't really accomplish that much. And then we've got A New Hope, which again, a little simple, but definitely very indicative, the ideal of the fact that there has been nothing but darkness in between 3 and 4, and there's been no real rays of positivity or hope or anything, and this is the first real chance we have to actually strike back and have a success against the Empire. Empire Strikes Back, the first time we really see the Empire really flexing its military might and really actually being active in its pursuit of the rebellion, because the Empire is now taking the rebellion seriously for the first time, really. Return of the Jedi is one of my personal favorites because it actually has 2 meanings. One is the obvious one. It is the return of the Jedi to the galactic stage. thanks to Luke and Leia. But the other thing that I love about the idea of Return of the Jedi is it's the concept of the return of the Jedi, not the Jedi Order. Now, this is something that was obviously not intended at the time, and don't mistake me for trying to say that it was. This was not some grand scheme or some grand architectural layout that was planned back in the... No. This is something that we can infer after the fact, because remember, the Jedi Order was flawed and decayed and basically wrong for a period of time that could be expressed in the centuries, up until Luke and Leia were the only Jedi left, and as Obi-Wan himself puts it in one of the books, you are not the last of the old Jedi, you are the first of the new. Hence my statement, it is the return of the Jedi as opposed to return of the Jedi Order. So anyways, my point, I digress, but the point is, all these titles, they make a degree of sense, and they don't bother me. Attack of the Clones. Okay, I could really analyze this title, but I don't think anyone wants me to spend too much time on this, so suffice it to say, it's dumb. The clones do attack people in this setting. They attack the other side of a particular conflict, in which both sides are technically the bad guys. I'll discuss that more later. The clones themselves are significant to the overall progression of this event, and most people assumed that the Clone Wars would be involved in this episode, because of course we did, because, well, I'll talk about that in a bit too. The title itself sounds dumb, and doesn't really have any thematic significance to what this episode is about. But that leads me to my point, and I'm actually not just digressing on this for any reason. This is one of the things Episode 2 does kind of badly. Everyone knows that the middle work in a piece, in an intended trilogy, is usually just the get from point A to point B thing. And for the most part, it does not have nearly as cohesive or strong of a plot, a central plot, as the first piece did or the third piece did. My favorite example of this is actually Mass Effect 2. Many arguments have been laid, and valid arguments no less, that Mass Effect 2 has a very weak plot, and that's because it does. Mass Effect 2 was not about its plot. Mass Effect 2 was about fleshing out the setting, fleshing out the characters, establishing more of the story, establishing more of the growth, really pushing into the themes of the work. Empire Strikes Back did that as well. The Two Towers did this as well. You know, there are several examples of this concept. The idea of using the second work in a piece to do that. So, Attack of the Clones doesn't really have a strong plot at all. The problem is, it kind of failed on what the second piece is supposed to do in fleshing out the setting more. Well, okay, that's a lie. Attack of the Clones actually fleshes out the setting a lot more. Props there. But it doesn't flesh out the characters as much as it should have. This should have been the moment where we really get to really examine Anakin Skywalker, Padme Amidala, and Obi-Wan Kenobi. Those three characters really should have been fleshed out to the nth degree in this episode. And we get little pieces of that. We do get that to some extent, but nowhere near as much as it should have. But again, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's go ahead and talk about... Let's talk about the CGI really quick. I shouldn't even say the CGI, because that's actually diminishing the point. Let's talk about the effects. They used a lot more in the terms of traditional effects in Episode 2 than they did in 1. And if you remember my mentioning, they also used a fair amount of traditional effects in Episode 1. But the point is, I felt like they simultaneously leaned more and less on CGI in Episode 2. And it's obvious, too. If you watch most of the scenes where it's obvious where they were leaning on traditional effects and then you CGI to touch it up, it looks great. There are so many scenes that just look amazing. But then there's a couple of scenes where it's literally 100% CGI, mostly to establishing shots, which look like CGI. And then there's the scenes where they're leaning a little bit too heavy on the CGI, and it's obvious that the only real thing there is a single person on a green thing, which is making movements on another green thing in a green room, you know? In other words, there's only one real thing involved. And it really shows. If you want a specific example, I'll give you one right off the top of my head, because I just finished the movie. The scenes where we show Dooku flying away on that speeder bike looked really, really fake. And again, it's obvious why. It was just Sir Christopher Lee on a green thing in the green room, nothing else real, no traditional effects, just him. And it shows. So again, it's one of those, what they did good, they did better, but what they did bad, they did worse situations. I also want to talk about the title. And by the title, I mean I'm misreading. Forgive me, because I'm probably going to be talking a little bit here. part of what I'm about to say is speculation, so there's your warning. One of the biggest questions I've been asked, and was asked even when this movie came out, is why are the Clone Wars not in the movies? For those of you not aware, the Clone Wars basically don't actually happen in the movies. I'm going to discuss this a little bit in detail, so forgive me for going into some depth here. For those of you not aware, back when Lucas first opened the floodgate on the extended continuity and all the extent of what that means, in order to make any given work that was considered canon, you had to submit your story ideas and they had to be approved. And this is obvious why. This wasn't a state, a Big Brother kind of a state thing. It was one particular organization was in charge of making sure all the canon was contiguous with all the other canon. I mean, there are plot holes, there are pieces where things fall through, but overall, everyone had to follow the same rule set so that nobody was basically saying something that didn't make any sense compared to what someone else said. So it could all be considered the same story, right? There was there's actually like 5, but there was one huge rule. No one could talk about the Clone Wars. Now, if those of you do not remember, the Clone Wars was actually name-dropped in the original trilogy. Very briefly and very lightly. Now, we don't know 100% what Lucas's original direction for the Clone Wars was, because a lot of that has been shrouded in the I'm playing Oblivion lately. The mists of time. Literally, this is not me trying to be facetious. This was the 70s, and Lucas's original draft bears basically no reality to A New Hope, which actually hit the screen. I'll talk about that when we get to that movie. So we're not really sure what his original intention was with the Clone Wars, but we do know that the addition of that was something that was significant because it was a tiny little attempt to add some depth to the setting and explain one of the reasons why the Empire had risen to power and why things were the way they were when the original trilogy came out. But the rule was no one could touch the Clone Wars. The very, very few exceptions to this were only mentions of it, and Timothy Zahn is probably the big exception there with the entire Thrawn trilogy and the significance of using the clones there, etc. And even that didn't actually touch on the Clone Wars per se. It only mentioned it mentioned them basically in passing, and that's it. And it just mentions the level of devastation was so bad that it caused most records from that area to be erased, and that's basically all we knew about it. So a lot of fans for so long had been desperate to figure out what the hell happened in the Clone War era. And yes, I was one of them. We don't know exactly what happened, but it is highly likely, I feel, that the original intent was to have the Clone Wars in and resolved in the movies. Now, you could argue that is what happened. The Clone Wars begin at the very end of Episode 2, and the Clone Wars end during Episode 3. But it is pretty clear that somewhere along the line someone came to Lucas, and we do know that there was a compromise that was made, but it's pretty clear someone went to whoever was in charge, Lucas or the entire executive staff or whatever, and said, we can't do the Clone Wars justice in just one movie. So why don't we make a compromise? And the compromise, which is the thing we do know is factual, is they would show the beginning and end of the Clone Wars in the movies. Now, this is a beautiful thing because it solves many different equations from a creative standpoint. Number one, it allows them to have a tremendous amount of character growth off camera, so we can show the kind of relationship that Obi-Wan and Anakin, for example, should have on screen without having to actually try and develop it on camera. Now, that may sound like a cheat, but my point is, it's hard to look at two characters and say, those are, best buddy Nakama for life when they've only been together for an hour and a half. It's one of the detriments, if you could call that, of creatively speaking, from making a movie in general. I'm not saying it's impossible. It is done. Most of the time, though, when that kind of thing done, it's done across movies. And if you're paying attention, most of the time it's done across movies, there's a time jump involved. In fact, I'm going to mention another time jump right here. A New Hope to Empire Strikes Back is a nice big time jump, and by the time Empire Strikes Back begins, Luke and Han are basically best friends, best buds. There's that Nakama thing going on again. It's the same concept. So they allow this great and extensive conflict to help flesh out the characters so that by the time the next movie starts, the audience is more on board with how close these characters have become, because they should have, because it's been several years, and they've been through all this hell together, right? The second point, and arguably the most important point of all, though, which is why I'm mentioning this last, is it allows the extended universe to flesh out the Clone Wars. It allows the books and the games and the TV shows, plural, the cartoon and then the CGI, to really examine the Clone Wars and to really show the Clone Wars as the galaxy-devastating events they are, because you cannot have that significant and sufficient of an impact in just one movie. You really can't. Not without cheating, not without cheapening it, not without just truncating it to the point of irrelevance. So we get to see all the extensiveness of the Clone Wars, and the setting is so much better for it. We get to see so much more of Anakin and his growth as a character, and Obi-Wan and his growth as a leader, and Yoda and his attachment to his personnel, and the setting getting fleshed out, and the brand new characters which are introduced in the Clone Wars, like Ahsoka and Asari Ventress and all those fun characters, and the books get to really go into the motivations of the characters involved. It was a good move, by my opinion, if you're not getting my point here. The biggest reason I bring this up, though, is one of the most common complaints I heard in the day was, why are the Clone Wars not in the movie? Because then we could just call it Episode 2, The Clone Wars. Well, I feel like I have answered that question, hopefully. If not, then I am doomed. Let's go ahead and briefly touch on the beautiful trap of Emperor Palpatine. There's this wonderful quote, which I'll be mentioning again next video when we come to Episode 3, that basically goes along the lines of, by going to war at all, the Jedi had already lost. The entire Clone Wars was always a trap for all of the Jedi. This is Palpatine's mindset in a nutshell. He has engineered a situation in which he will be able to take absolute power over the dominant military force of the galaxy, no matter which side in this war wins. He is also, but that was always secondary, because the real point was he needed to remove the Jedi from the equation. Not kill them all. That would be terrible. That would just turn them into martyrs. That would make whoever killed them this horrible, abominable person in the views of the people. He had to ensure that the common people, at the very least, doubted the Jedi. He had to plant that seed. For those of you not aware, the official story about Count Dooku, which comes into fruition in Episode 3, is that he never actually left the Jedi Order, and his command and control over the Separatist Union was basically him trying to, and it was the Jedi Council trying to take power from the legitimate elected leaders of the Republic, aka Palpatine and the Senate, which really turned a lot of politicians and people in power against the Jedi after the fact, and also helped to flesh out that whole removing the Jedi's perspective in the public's eyes plan to begin with. But the most important part of all of this plan was it was a beautiful way to ensure that every Jedi was committed to the war, and therefore completely incapable of escaping the inevitability of what that war would mean. There are a lot of Jedi who died before Order 66 was executed, but I'll talk about this a little bit more later, pretty much at the end of this video, actually. There is one, of course, final point here to be mentioned. You remember all of my discussion about how the droid army was the strongest in the galaxy, and that's pathetic? That is so important to the overall plan for Palpatine's conquest of this galaxy, because it's true, the Republic's military, if you could even call it that, was disgustingly, abhorrently pathetic, to the point of being laughable. He needed a strong military force to conquer this galaxy, and to enforce his will. He needed it. Now, it's pretty obvious, especially based on the books and whatnot, that Palpatine always intended the Republic to win. If for some reason they didn't, he would still have control of the Trade Federation, so that would still work for him. But the intended goal is for the Republic to win. Now, the point I'm trying to make here is that the best possible way to make this military is to ensure a war happens, because the only way a stagnant nation like that is going to build a strong military is through an actual, active war. Forgive me for pointing this out, but the United States military was not bad, but kind of lackluster until arguably World War I came around. And then much more so when World War II came around and we became involved in that one. This is a bad example, so forgive me. I could give more examples, but I'm trying not to get too much into sensitive topics. Point being, this is the kind of thing that has been seen in real-life history more than once. The army was just kind of there until a war came along, and then people galvanized, and oh, now we're the dominant military force on the planet. it's beautifully ironic because, I mean, the clones were always necessary to that battle. The clone army was always required for the galvanizing of this. But the point was to use the clones as the starting point, and then from that have the actual people, the Jedi and the personnel who joined the army and the career officers gain experience through combat, so that by the time the Clone War had ended, he now had a honed and seasoned military force on his side. And that is exactly what happened, too. Alright, so let's get into the movie proper here. My god, I don't even know how long I've been talking already. I love the fact that it is very indicative of how Palpatine is perceived, that he is basically an advisor of the Jedi Council, that they will actually acquiesce to his requests and his advice, that they actually hold meetings with regards to him and share with him important matters of state and Jedi business. It really speaks to just how much Palpatine has portrayed himself as the only sane man amongst the Senate, the one politician who is not interested in political gain, but the one who is willing to listen and have wisdom and reason. I mention this because it's very likely, especially given what we read in the books and whatnot, that Palpatine was that kind of person. It's the perfect way to maintain that kind of illusion, by actually doing it. He actually was willing to listen to reason. He actually was willing to lose political ground and actually not play the political, Game of Thrones, basically, amongst the Senate, so that the Jedi did actually have reason to trust him. I'll mention my big theory about Palpatine in Episode 3, by the way. And he has this brilliant portrayal of this kindly old man that continues in this one, and he looks so old and so ragged. It really adds to that presentation, because we know why that's actually happening. The amount of power he's conducting is so massive that it's literally eating his body alive. But it adds to that perspective of this, feeble old man who can only barely do what he can for the people who are trying to manipulate him, and the one guy who is trying to do his best and is haggard by his efforts to accomplish the greater good for the people who he's trying to manipulate on the other side of the equation. I also like the very first thing we learned about Count Dooku is that he was an ex-Jedi. That scene really shows one of the blind spots of the Jedi. They mentioned the thought that, he's a political idealist, not a terrorist, or whatever. That entire comment, he couldn't try to assassinate you. It's not in his character. We do know that Dooku did order that assassination, although it was only for political ideals. He only did it because it was required for Newt Gunray to allow the Trade Federation to join the Separatists, the Confederacy of Independent Systems. But the significance of that is it really highlights, as so many other things do, how blind the Jedi have basically become, especially at this point in time. In other words, the Jedi could never possibly conceive of the fact that someone who was a Jedi, someone who was an ex-Jedi, could ever be that manipulative or horrible to try and assassinate someone. That's ludicrous. That's ridiculous. It is far easier and more likely to go ahead and just think that he is someone who is misguided. He is an idealist fighting for what he believes is right, because that's what any Jedi would do. They would never stoop to such a thing as that. If I can digress for just a moment, Christopher Lee himself, awesome gentleman, actually went on record as saying that he personally believes Count Dooku does not believe in the very concept of morality, that it is something that is irrelevant to him, that basically there's only what is required to do in order to accomplish things. In his own words, amoral, a very amoral and intelligent kind of character. I kind of tend to agree with his portrayal there, but anyways, moving on. So I have a note here called awful dialogue. Up until this one big scene, I've been enjoying this movie all the way up into this scene where Anakin has to talk with Padme and Jar Jar and bickers with Obi-Wan in front of other people like a child. Now, it's obvious to see where that scene was supposed to go, if you really look at it. The structure, the substructure of the scene is obvious. It was intended to show that Anakin's perspective is much more focused on the now and getting things done, whereas Obi-Wan's is much more patient and guidance and not saying everything he's thinking, whereas Anakin is just blurting out everything. You can see the idea that Obi-Wan was actually thinking along the same lines as Anakin was, and just didn't want to reveal his hand, basically. He was trying to play things close to the chest. But instead what we get is two children bickering, and it's really kind of pathetic. And it's just because the dialogue is so poorly written. I'll be touching on that more later as well. It's also worth noting, I feel like this overall section would have worked better with Anakin and Padme. I'll go ahead and talk about this now. Anakin is someone who... okay. I'm going to make a lot of notes as we go through here that I feel like would have worked. This would have worked better if Anakin had been a teenager back in Episode 1. This would have worked better if Anakin was a teenager back in Episode 1. But his interactions with Padme really indicate the difference between the perspective of the two people. And the dialogue is atrocious. I'm sorry, there's no salvaging it. Truthfully told, that is kind of common because most writers, myself included, simply cannot write certain types of dialogue. We're not good at it. That's why, and I've talked about this before in my Voyager videos tons of times, this is one of the reasons why scientific consultants, military consultants, romantic consultants exist. One of the reasons why you'll have a section that just says, please flesh this out, and then someone else will come in and write it in. So the romance scenes are atrociously written. And the funny thing is, George actually did... Remember, this is Episode 2. By this point in time, George Lucas had basically had, well, a bit of an epiphany. I'll talk about that more in just a moment. And let other people help out. But when you do that, you need to have other people who know what they're doing to help out. Not just people who are also already involved in the film, George. But anyways, the difference between the two, again, the substructure is obvious there. We have Anakin, someone who was taken away from her and basically maintained this thought of her as this idealized version as he's going through his life of... Anakin was sheltered, okay? This is how the Jedi do things. This is one of the reasons... I'm sorry, I need to make this clear. This is why the Jedi Order does things. This is how the Jedi Order does things. They shelter you to almost a severe point because they are so afraid, ironically, of what could happen if you are not, of what is the possible ramifications thereof. So Anakin goes to be sheltered, doesn't have much in the way of real-life experience, doesn't have a chance to actually grow as a person, with the sole exception of the one person he can actually connect to, which is touched on in this movie, and it fleshed out tremendously in the books and in the third movie. In other words, Obi-Wan, his effectual father, for all intents and purposes. That's the only actual human connection he has other than the one in his head. In other words, the one between him and Padme, who was a significant force. And again, this would have worked better if he was a teenager. But imagine if the friendship, no romantic connections, just the friendship between Anakin and Padme had been fleshed out so much more in Episode 1, to the point where it would be obvious why he would basically fixate on her in his mind. And I don't mean this in any kind of creepy fashion. It's obvious that such a kind of friendship would at least lead to romantic feelings, especially if they were reciprocated. It's also obvious that the way he was sheltered would lead him to cling to the one thing he still has left to feel in such a manner with that. And it's also obvious that the Jedi Order were a bunch of idiots who had no idea what they were doing. So in other words, they just bungled the situation to begin with. Forgive me for segueing for just a moment. I've often said that Anakin was doomed from the start because of Palpatine. But one of my viewers, I was talking this on the live stream, one of my viewers correctly pointed out the inaccuracy in that. Anakin was doomed from the start because of Palpatine and the Jedi Order. Both of them ensured his fall to the dark side. But moving on. But Padme, by contrast, she wasn't sheltered. She was basically flung out into the world. She was still quite young, a teenager herself, when Episode 1 ended. And she immediately leapt into political life, which is not exactly the nicest thing in the world, especially in the Old Republic era, and immediately became basically under attack in constant circumstance by the rather severe machinations that were happening in the Senate at that point in time, and the fact that Republic was basically self-destructing around her, and the reality of her planet trying to regather itself from having been under an occupied force, which was, by all intents and purposes, raiding and looting the crap out of them. She did actually grow. She had a chance to show the kind of person she was, because Padme had what Anakin did not. She had adversity. And so she had to overcome that adversity. And so the Padme we see is actually relatively well presented in this movie, if only she had better dialogue, as someone who has driven herself to have the sort of mental discipline and self-control that a Jedi should. And that's the beautiful irony of it. We actually see that differencing of perspective of why the Order is so wrong in their teaching perspectives, because we see exactly what can happen if they had done things properly with Padme, and we see exactly what did happen when they did things the way they did with Anakin. I also And another point. This is, I'm sorry, one more touch point. I mentioned this extinguishing thing here in my notes. I keep referencing my Voyager videos. I talked about this when it came to the episode Alter Ego with regards to Tuvok. In other words, the Vulcan ideal over in Star Trek is often, well, let's say the Vulcans themselves disagree on it, but the idea is to find order amongst chaos, not to enforce order from chaos. That's a clear distinction, right? The Jedi Order tries to enforce order amongst chaos. The Sith just kind of fling themselves in and laugh the whole way. But the Dark Jedi try to, if you can forgive me for being blunt, try to go ahead and use the chaos to their own perspective. The Light Jedi, the actually good Light Jedi, try to find order in chaos. Padme, through her actions and discipline, clearly has reached a point where she has learned to temper the way she feels, temper the way she thinks, but never extinguish it, and that is a crucial difference. Remember, Vulcans do feel. They do have emotions. They just temper them, control them, discipline them. This is, in my personal opinion, what the ideal of a Light Jedi should be. Someone who still feels, someone who still has connections, but has the mental discipline and self-control to maintain that and to find the order amongst the chaos. You follow? And I mention this especially because, again, Anakin had only two things keeping him going. Obi-Wan, obvious, and his thoughts of Padme. So it's obvious that he would have had romantic feelings for her over however long it's been because of the way those would have nurtured. But it's also just as obvious that Padme would have had romantic feelings in return because she was in the same general circumstance. Remember that analogy I used on my Dragon Age stream, the ideal of someone who, I've been in this horrible, terrible, adversity, and the only thing I have to cling to is my idealized memories of a certain individual, whether it be romantic or otherwise. It is very clear that Padme thought of Anakin just as much as Anakin thought of Padme. The difference is Anakin had no control or composure over it, whereas Padme tempered those feelings, never got rid of them, never removed them, but always was thinking of him in the back of her mind, which again makes this make more sense if he was a teenager back in episode 1. I'm going to be saying that a bit. Forgive me. Obi-Wan, in a nutshell, is beautifully summarized in this thing. I'll actually be referencing this again later. Anakin, he's talking to Anakin, and Anakin says, I can sense everything. And Obi-Wan says, your senses are not so attuned. Anakin retorts with, and yours are. And this is who Obi-Wan is in a nutshell. Obi-Wan's response is, possibly. Obi-Wan, as he is presented pretty much throughout all the works, is someone who acknowledges and understands that he himself has his own failings, that he is not flawless, that he is not perfect. In other words, he is probably one of the only examples of a true Light Jedi who is not a member of the Jedi Order, to make that distinction clear, throughout the course of the prequels. I know there's some gray area in that. I don't want to get too much into that, especially given the Clone Wars series. But the point I'm trying to make is, Yoda himself mentions the problem with so many, I'll talk about this in a moment too, so many Jedi becoming arrogant and confident and self-assured of themselves. Obi-Wan is that perfect balance of having some level of confidence, but never letting it boil over into arrogance. He knows he's flawed. He knows he makes mistakes. He knows he might not be right. And he acknowledges that. But again, I'll touch on that much later. I also feel like it's worth noting that Obi-Wan leaps out of the window to grab the droid and just do it. Virtually no forethought whatsoever. I know this sounds weird, but I love that because that's one of those tiny little scenes that really highlights the kind of character he has. Because it's true. Obi-Wan is very much the kind of character, he's patient, he's willing to wait for the opportune moment to do something. He's not going to rush in, he's not going to, he's going to have the patience, he's going to have the self-discipline to not let on what he's going. But the moment he sees that it now is the best time to accomplish B, there is not a flicker of hesitation in him. We see this even in A New Hope, I'll talk about that much later. But the moment he sees that situation unfold, he realizes that now's the time to act, and he just lunges through the window. I love that. I also really, really love the chemistry between Obi-Wan and Anakin in this movie. The lines are not as good as they should be, but it's worth noting that there is chemistry on camera despite the lines, and that's indicative. That's good. And it really shows the kind of excellent acting that Ewan McGregor can do, and the excellent non-vocal acting Hayden Christensen can do. And I know you're looking at me weird for that, but I'll discuss the Hayden Christensen effect a little bit later. But I do like the chemistry the two have, especially just the way they banter. showing the fact that they have actually grown closer and have some kind of a bond between themselves. And it's that wonderful lore sort of basically presentation as if they were brothers kind of a thing, you know? And I love the scene where they're just sitting there, and Obi-Wan's like, oh, she went completely the other way. And Anakin's like, I'm terribly sorry, Master. And Obi-Wan's like, oh, well, we'll have to get back to the thing. And Anakin's like, excuse me, and he just hops out of the thing. And Obi-Wan looks over, and he just says, oh, I hate it when he does that. That whole scene and the dialogue between the two, top notch. I also really like the perspective of beneath the surface of Coruscant. I actually mentioned this back in my episode 1 thing. What we see here is literally beneath the surface. Or in other words, everything we've seen up to so far of Coruscant has always been up here. We see the clouds and the sky and the top layer of Coruscant. This is the first time we visually see in something that isn't a video game or a book or whatever, just below the surface. It's not too far below. We don't go down into the really bad stuff, but we do get to see one of the portrayals of how life is just below the surface, and it's good. And again, one of the things Episode 2 does do properly, it does actually flesh out the setting in many ways. And I know I'm going to say this at least twice more, but I want to give huge props to the environment designers, the artists who actually did the sketches, and the people who built the sets and actually did the CGI touch-ups to really flesh it out to make it look the way it does. Admittedly, I had some kind of Nar Shaddaa flashbacks as we were going through Episode 2, but nevertheless, definitely a positive for me. I also love, probably more than any other scene in this entire movie, the scene in the bar highlights the difference in perspectives between Obi-Wan and Anakin. I know I just touched on this, but this is that perspective in a nutshell. Remember how that scene goes, or rewatch it or whatever. Obi-Wan walks up to the bar and gets a drink and sits there and waits patiently. Anakin paces amongst the people, looking around, desperately trying to look for his assailant. That is the difference in perspective between Obi-Wan and Anakin in a nutshell. Obi-Wan is patiently waiting for the opportune moment. Anakin is desperately trying to make things happen right now. Very clear. And it's worth noting neither of them are particularly necessarily wrong. But the thing I want to highlight most of all, and this is really fleshed out in the overall Clone Wars, is that neither side being necessarily right is compounded by the fact that the two working together accomplish so much more than either approach would without. Having the aggression and the passive patience working together, it's basically the ideology of the Grey Jedi in a nutshell, right there. And I feel one of the reasons why the two were so damn successful and accomplished so much and grew so close to each other throughout the Clone Wars. I gotta just make a comment of it. I just have a note here. It just says death sticks. You want to buy some death sticks? It still made me laugh. Shrug. Star Wars actually doing comedy properly, just for once. One tiny little note. We basically didn't really know, except for a few tiny exceptions, about shapeshifting being a thing in Star Wars. That's a semi-staple thing of fantasy and science fiction in general. But hasn't really been a big thing in Star Wars. And they just sort of introduced this shapeshifter kind of out of nowhere, and then don't actually do anything with it. And I only mention that. I'm not sure I necessarily disagree with that. I can see why they didn't want to establish any kind of, shall we say, conspiracist or paranoiac perspective on shapeshifting. But it's just interesting that they introduced that and then walked away from it, because the fact that she was a shapeshifter was basically inconsequential to the overall story, setting, plot, characterization, etc. I love the trail that Palpatine leaves for the Jedi to get to Kamino. It is just subtle enough so that you're questioning whether or not it's deliberate, and yet it is not too subtle as to the point where the Jedi would never be able to find the trail. But at the same time, it is just obvious enough that the Jedi are you're constantly thinking, okay, this is some kind of a setup, and yet not so obvious that you can ignore it. It is pretty much that perfect balance of following the trail, following the trap into the perspective, so that one way or another the Jedi would end up in Kamino. I also really like, I'm just going down the list here and during the scenes. I love the scene where Anakin goes to Palpatine. It is very indicative, and this is something that's done later as well. Anakin has just been given his first assignment ever, and the first person he goes to talk about it is Palpatine. It really shows in this one beautiful scene just how much of a camaraderie and friendship has grown between Palpatine, at least on the surface, and Anakin, and how much Anakin trusts and confides in Palpatine. I have no doubt that at this point in time, and even by Episode 3, Anakin thinks of Palpatine as basically one of his true friends, right up there with Obi-Wan. But he can never think of Obi-Wan the same way he can Palpatine, because Obi-Wan is by nature his role model, his tutor, and so he has those feelings of abrasiveness or rebelliousness or whatever he has towards Obi-Wan do not exist when he thinks of Palpatine. It could be argued that the person he is actually closest to is Palpatine. And there is no denying whatsoever that Palpatine has specifically made himself approachable, kind, understanding, forgiving, and just that kind of person who is willing to listen, specifically so he and Anakin would grow to have that kind of friendship. Because that's the kind of person Palpatine is. Very manipulative and very willing to look at the long-term goals. I also just feel like commenting that I love the blocking in the scene where they're walking away. Palpatine's walking in the way that, Emperor Palpatine did in Return, and Anakin's walking with his arms to the side and his cloak coming out just enough, just the same way Vader used to. So it's just there's no attention is drawn to it. There's no dark music playing, and the camera doesn't linger too long. It's just done just right, basically. So here's where we talk about Yoda's comment I mentioned earlier. It is a beautiful irony that Yoda makes this comment about self-assuredness and arrogance. Too sure of themselves, the Jedi are. Too confident in their own abilities. I mentioned this with regards to Obi-Wan earlier, but Yoda's comment is very indicative of the way that the Order in general has become, and how Yoda himself has become, because as we'll discuss all the way over in Episode 3, Yoda himself has fallen into this exact same trap. He is so self-assured and so arrogant at this point in time in his life that it never occurs to Yoda that he's wrong. Well, it does occur to him in Episode 3, but at this point in time, it does not occur to him. It does not cross his mind. All that occurs to him is that he sees the flaw in others, and he's like, for shame, Also kind of indicative of why someone who was incredibly skilled, incredibly intellectual, and incredibly powerful could actually break from the Order, because of the fact that that person would naturally reach the conclusions that I have, and so many other fans are, that the Order is wrong, it's flawed, it's broken. Whether or not they would turn to the dark side is debatable, but this is exactly what happened to Dooku. I'll talk about him more later. Then we have a scene where Anakin whines to Padme. Bleh. Now, there are some good core ideas in this. There are. First of all, the core idea that Anakin is trying to repress himself constantly, because that's what the Jedi Order teaches and preaches, for that matter. Pontificates constantly on the idea that you have to always keep yourself under this Vulcan-like level of self-control. Probably to too much of a severe extent, but I digress. The idea that he probably has been keeping himself under this sufficient control, and it has been a strain for him, especially because Anakin doesn't really think like that. He doesn't really believe in the concept of that, passiveness or that wait or patience, as I've already highlighted in his perspective and his philosophy. He is someone who wants to take action, and so having to do that is a constant aggravation to him every single day. And the beauty is this scene should have been better written, because what the scene is actually showing us is just how relaxed and comfortable he feels around Padme, probably without even realizing it. He just starts talking to her openly, willingly, without hiding anything, without holding anything back, because he's not afraid of what she's going to say. He's not afraid she's going to judge him. He's not afraid that she's going to look down upon him. He's just willing to openly express himself to her. And it also highlights an interesting problem with Obi-Wan's perspective, at least up to this point. That will actually be corrected from hence on, thanks to the Clone Wars. But up until this point, it's very obvious that Obi-Wan's biggest flaw is he has been maintaining a velvet prison around Anakin. He does care about Anakin, that is clear. And he does think of them as his brother. If not by now, then definitely by the time Episode 3 rolls around. And so it's not like he is doing what the Order does and treating him like another cog in the machine, but Obi-Wan is nevertheless afraid, just like so many of the others in the Order are, afraid of basically making a mistake, of not living up to Qui-Gon's potential and living up to his master's expectations, of not living up to his own expectations, of not doing well enough for Anakin. And so he keeps Anakin basically cloistered, not literally, not physically, but in terms of his training, in terms of his regime, in terms of the way Obi-Wan acts around Anakin, very rarely allowing his own mask to slip, because he is so concerned and cares so much about Anakin that he wants to ensure that he doesn't do anything wrong, which is another one of the reasons why Anakin feels so repressed all the time. Then we go to the 50s bar. I just feel like commenting on this. I actually asked 4 of my friends who have watched this movie, did the 50s bar bother you, the diner? And they said, nope. I mentioned this because when this movie came out, there were 2 things I heard, 3 actually, 3 things I heard that were most complained about. The bad romance, duh. The bad CGI, not sure I agree with that, but I already talked about that basically. And the diner's bar. Now, feel free to give your own thoughts and opinions. As always, I want to hear everyone's different discussions. But the diner bar never actually bothered me. And it didn't bother any of the other 4 people I just mentioned. It was just another little bit of flavor and fluff that kind of made sense in context of the setting. It was just this one little pinprick of setting building. That's all. Speaking of setting building, then we go to the Jedi Librarian. Here's the interesting thing. I'm going to go ahead and merge this point and the next point together. The librarian's comment about how anything that doesn't exist in the Jedi archives does not actually exist is very indicative of what I mentioned earlier with regards to Yoda's comment. The arrogance, the sheer self-assured superiority of the Jedi Order that has gotten so prolific that even one of their librarians, who I believe is a Jedi herself, I don't remember, I was going to look this up, but it doesn't care that much. But otherwise, even if she's not a Jedi, it is still indicative of that mentality, that self-assured, well, no, the Jedi are above reproach. And that extends to all things of the Jedi. The Jedi Order code and the Jedi's library and the Jedi's, capacity in battle. That'll come up later. Beyond reproach. So it was very indicative. And also, it's worth noting that only 2 people, well, 3 people, really actually allowed the thought to occur to them that the Jedi archives could have been tampered with. Obi-Wan, who was the first one who thought about it, Yoda, because he's Yoda, and children. This is, now, the former 2 are obvious. I don't feel like there's anything to be discussed there. But the child comment really shows with a magnifying glass just how bad this culture of the Jedi has become. Only someone who has not yet been indoctrinated, or, I'm sorry, I'm saying that wrong. Only someone who has not been passively affected by the culture of superiority around them, which is kind of the difference from indoctrination because they're not really programming them or anything, could ever consider the possibility that there is something flawed within the Jedi Order. And thus it's very natural that a child would say, well, what if it's just flawed? What if it's wrong? What if someone reprogrammed or something? Obi-Wan's own comment is basically, that's impossible, isn't it? And Yoda's like, I just feel like that's very indicative. Oh, by the way, this is a pet peeve of mine. For those of you who have not heard me use these different terms, a pet peeve is something that doesn't actually matter, it just bothers me, even though it shouldn't. Whereas a real peeve is something that does actually matter, and then bothers me. So a pet peeve here is that they call them younglings. That just bugs the crap out of me. Call them children, it's not that hard. Alright, moving on. There is a certain irony in Anakin's comments on love. It's very ham-fisted and, as always, poorly written. But it is interesting in its own right because I kind of agree with what he's saying on the surface of things. The Jedi Order, actually, that whole control, I've already talked about that, but the Jedi Order also specifically goes out of its way to indicate that you are disallowed from making connections, from making, attachments to other people, emotional attachments. And one could argue that that extends to the thought that you must not love, or care about, or otherwise give a damn, right? Complete impartiality. But I kind of like his perspective that the Jedi are also taught to be compassionate without regard, which by his own acknowledgement does kind of feel like a form of love in its own right. And obviously he's just talking out of his ass because he's trying to get closer to Padme, and again is badly written. But it's just interesting food for thought that Anakin himself has had time to think on this very matter, and probably does actually agree with what he's saying. We'll talk about the attachment thing more later. Padme's comment also, I had mentioned this earlier, I just want to mention it here because this is when it really occurred to me. Padme's comment about not being ready, and everything I mentioned earlier about her growth through adversity and how she was basically flung into the arena. I mean, the first thing she did in canon when she was 14 was, okay, now you're a queen of this world and you're at war and the Republic's falling apart. Go! That was basically the first thing she really did in her term, and it's very indicative of, again, of why and how she grew the way she did, as opposed to Anakin, who of course did not. There's a lot of really badly written dialogue in this section. This is where the knee to the bollocks really comes in. I actually have 3 notes here in just a moment that are literally ugh, ugh, and another ugh. I know what those are, but I'll get to that in just a moment. But one of the first times this comes up is Padme is talking with Anakin around the new queen, whose name I don't remember and don't care about, and Bibble, the true villain of the masterpiece. Bonus points if you get the joke. And she just displays a near total lack of regard for any level of social nicety or indeed diplomacy when she just completely and utterly dismisses Anakin. Anakin then tries to rejoin to her, and then she decides to mention to him the thing she should have said to begin with, the diplomatic thing. The whole thing is ham-fisted, poorly written, poorly acted, and doesn't really add anything to anything, so I'm not even sure why this scene's even there. You know what, I'm going to go ahead and skip ahead, and then we'll get back to the Obi-Wan thing, which is more interesting. Anakin and Padme's awful dialogue is so bad. Oh, this is the first ugh. Right here. I can't even begin to explain how bad it is. I have gone on record as saying this is the second worst written love story I have ever read or watched or whatever. It's just atrociously bad. It's just, right in the bollocks. Here's the crucial thing here. In my opinion, there are differences of opinion on this, but in my opinion, the relationship between Padme and Anakin is absolutely critical to Anakin's story. And Anakin's story is what the 3 prequels should have been about, and in some cases is what they're about. So I don't think you should have just cut the burgeoning relationship between the two. But again, if you had shown the friendship growing in the first thing, and if he was already a teenager, and if you show most of their growing together in this thing as show him trying to overcome not just his Jedi, indoctrination, not just the things he's been taught and trained to do, but also his own nervousness, his own fear, his own lack of self-confidence, his own lack of assurance as he tries to admit and finally stumbles over to the point where he actually confesses his feelings for her and then is immediately rebuffed. Don't have them kiss early on. That defeats all of the point. Have her rebuff him and then walk away and have him have no idea what to do with that and has him try to recover from us and then show us, the viewers, one little scene, no dialogue, of her trying hard to recover and show the tears as she's actually contemplating what she does. Because the point here, and I'll talk about this, I'll just talk about it now. The point here is that it should have had a culmination in that scene right before the arena. The culmination still happens, but they didn't do anything to earn it. There was no effort made. Well, there was effort made, but it was bad. They failed at earning that culmination of the growth of them getting closer and closer together as they work together and understand their feelings for each other. The point is, Padme always cared about Anakin. The point is, Padme always wanted to be with Anakin, but due to her own discipline, her own control, her own belief in how things are, she could not let herself, because it was such a suboptimal situation, such a terrible thing that she couldn't let to do, and yet have it show more and more in tiny little tidbits throughout the course of this movie that she is starting to realize that her desire to be with him is actually something that is overcoming her desire to do her duty and her belief that it is impossible to reach that point where she thinks it is worth actually taking that risk between the two of them in order to have that great thing that she longs for so much. And the whole time we see on his side of things, or rather we should have seen on his side of things, the idea of him growing and trying to understand this emotion that he has had quietly in the back of his mind this whole time that explodes right in his face as he finally meets her and finally interacts with her, and he's so nervous and he's so uncertain and he's trying desperately to try and overcome his own fears with regard to the situation, and the whole time he's trying to control his own feelings and his own hurt at being rejected by her, and his desire nevertheless to take care of her because he does actually care about her, and constantly trying to protect her while at the same time not overstep any boundaries, until finally that flooding relief as he realizes in that final culmination she does care about him. That should have been that scene. I'm talking about the scene again right before the arena. She should have finally said, I can't hold this back anymore, I can't do this anymore. We're about to die, and if we're about to die, you need to know the truth. I have been keeping this from you for your sake, for my sake, for our sake, but I'm not even sure that's the right thing anymore. I'm not even sure of anything anymore. I need you to know that I love you. I need you to know that I care about you. You are someone who is close to me, and I don't know if this could work, but I would like to have the chance to try. And have him just die emotionally as he realizes this whole time, because remember, Anakin does not have subtlety, he does not have wisdom, he has power and aggression, and he knows how to act. And so this whole time he has been missing these signs that we, the viewers, have been given. So now as he sees this, he is flooded with emotion. Have him just disintegrate as he realizes that at long last she is with him. The relief and the overjoy that he would experience. And just because I'm a sap, I am a romantic sap, I'll admit it. Have that revelation be the thing that gives him the strength and will to desire to go ahead and try and escape from the arena rather than just accepting their fate. I mean, I'm not saying that's the only thing. That would be stupid. But have him try harder than he ever would, because he has a +8 morale bonus because of that, if I can put it into just blunt terms. Because that is how life works. You will try harder if you have a good motivation to do so, and he was just given a great motivation. He wants to get her out of here, he wants to get out of here, and he wants to actually try. Wouldn't that have been great? But no. No, instead what we get is, I don't like sand. It's coarse, rough, it gets everywhere. One thing I do want to say in praise of the movie is Hayden Christensen's acting. I know. I've said this before and I've said this again. The man is not a bad actor. He had bad lines and bad direction. But you can see the hints of his acting capacity whenever he has to react visually. It's most apparent when he has no lines at all. But in this scene, there's a good example of it when he's telling her and trying to explain the truth of his emotions to her. He looks so... He's trying to look self-assured because that's his general perspective. I know what I'm doing is right because I know what I'm doing is right. But at the same time, you could see on his face he is so afraid of being rejected, of being wrong, of making a mistake or screwing things up. And all of that is playing across his face. He's very good at portraying the kind of emotions Anakin should be feeling at any point in time. I'll be highlighting these Hayden Christensen acting moments as we go through, but this is another one. It's weird. And very well done. And then, okay, now I'm going to rewind a bit, movie-wise. We'll talk more about that terribleness in a moment, because we're not done being kicked on the bollocks. More praise for the environmental design team. Kamino's pristine, amazing white is very awesome and very distinct within the Star Wars setting. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, it's the only time we see something that looks that clinically clean as far as an entire architectural style rather than an individual area in the entirety of Star Wars, and this includes the extended universe. I could be wrong, forgive me. But it really... It's a wonderful tool because it emphasizes the very cultural mindset of the Kamino people. They're on a storm world, basically. It's primarily ocean, and it's constant, raving, destructive, and yet inside it is pristine, quiet, clean, everything's white, everything's peaceful. It really shows, just in this way that doesn't have to be expressed at all, the level of intent that was being done with regards to their culture and the way they think of things, the way they have to have that sort of enforced order on chaos. See how this ties into the theme, kind of a thing. Similarly, just because I feel like talking about it here, there's the architectural design of Geonosia, which is crude and rough and brusque, and basically... It gives the very, very distinct impression, and the people who designed this actually did look into real-life examples of an insect hive, something that is very natural and kind of gross and just has this sort of melted liquid feel to it, as the various Geonosians themselves do have this very dirty, crude effect to them, you know. Very distinct, and also, ironically, still thematically significant, because what the Geonosians are doing are finding order in chaos, and finding their place in the chaos, as opposed to the Caminos who try to enforce it. Interesting, if probably unintentional, but just regardless of the intentional thematic significance, the environmental design for both Camino and Geonosia is through the roof. I just wanted to give props for that. Then we have the scene with Jango and Obi-Wan. Now, Jango Fett, excuse me. I always have a tendency to, my A's. My accents are weird. We only really find out about this in the books, but Jango wanted his own son as his payment, other than the money. That itself actually speaks volumes about his kind of character, and really we don't actually learn that much about Jango Fett, even in the ancillary works. He's fleshed out, but only a little bit. But his desire to have that truly pragmatic son really strikes me as indicative of Jango's own perspective. He wanted someone who was completely amoral. He wanted to raise someone who would be truly willing to deal with the galaxy on its own terms and to thrive and be successful in that galaxy. And he believed the only way to do that was have someone who literally lacked a moral compass. Now, as we know, that's actually incorrect. Boba did have a moral compass. He did have things that he believed were right and wrong. But it's just indicative of Jango's perspective that that's what he wanted for Boba. I also really don't like the scene between Jango and Obi-Wan. It's just awkward and unnecessary. It's literally one of those scenes where both characters involved know the other person is lying, and both characters involved, for whatever reason, do not feel fit to actually be honest about what's going on, so they just kind of talk circles around each other and don't accomplish anything. But even regarding that, even ignoring that, I should say, the dialogue is kind of bad. And I quote, "I'm just a simple man trying to make his way in the universe," or the galaxy, or whatever. I'm probably getting the quote exactly wrong, but that's kind of my point. It's not really that memorable or noteworthy now, is it? And then, the movie makes an attempt at mood whiplash. Twice, actually. The first mood whiplash is it goes from the examination and understanding of the clone army and all the significance of that, and any true Star Wars fan, excuse me, I don't mean to sound elitist about that, but any Star Wars fan who, like me, has a caring about the very concept of the Clone Wars, sees that and goes, "Oh my god, the clones! There's a clone army here!" And pieces just start to fall into place. And then we go to Anakin and Padme, who are frolicking in the fields. Do I need to add anything to that? I mean, really. I'm just sitting here just trying to mentally overcome the hurdle of those scenes. And it's plural, too, because... I'll get to that. But they're frolicking. And this is the horrible part. They bother to use the scene to actually have a little bit, tiny little bit of character examination, which wasn't actually necessary, but whatever. The point is the discussion about politics between Anakin and Padme. Anakin's approach to politics is pretty much laid bare in his discussion. It's kind of poorly written because all the scenes between them are poorly written. But he nevertheless lays bare his perspective on things. Anakin believes in the concept of a benevolent dictatorship, and he never says it, but it's very obvious based on the way he portrays it that he actually believes that there is someone who should be in charge. Palpatine, the man who he has grown to trust and think of as a friend, the man who has always been honest with him and straightforward with him. Ironically, Palpatine would later actually gain great success in becoming closer to Anakin by being honest with him. But I digress. And so he does this, but it's also indicative, again, of the fact that Anakin does not think of the details or the gray. Anakin does have a bit of a black and white perspective on things. Padme, someone who is an experienced politician, knows it doesn't work that way. And he flat out tells Anakin, it doesn't work. You know, people getting together and deciding what's best for the people, that doesn't work. People don't agree. And then a benevolent dictatorship, that's just, no. And that should have been expanded more, I feel. But instead we get the dumb scene where the two frolic some more. And then we get another This is my third ugh. This is my third ugh. Another scene between the two. I don't even have any notes on that third scene other than the word ugh. I mean, really. Ugh. But it's the scene where they're sitting there at the dining table. What does that scene accomplish? Wait. I'm sorry, no, that's the second ugh, isn't it? Because then we have the third ugh. The third ugh is when we get to the point where then they're sitting in yet another dress for her in this, like, poorly lit room, and they discuss how they can never have a relationship together. I'm just going to go ahead and summarize. If you watch these scenes on mute, they're better. And that's really all I have to say to that. I'm not good at writing romance either. I think I've just demonstrated that because I was rewriting that pre-arena scene earlier on the fly. But, okay, moving on. So, one other interesting thing about Jango Fett, really quick. Forgive me, I keep sitting like this. My back's been killing me lately. He is basically one of our first times, arguably the first time, we see what has become the bounty hunter archetype on Star Wars on the big screen. Now, I know what you're going to say. No, Boba was first. Bear me out. The bounty hunter archetype was built off of Boba Fett. But that archetype kind of took off and became its own thing. The reason one of the classic iconic classes, if you could call that, in Star Wars, and I'm not even just talking about Tor, but across all of Star Wars Extended Universe, is the bounty hunter, is because of how popular Boba Fett was at the time, and because of how interesting that type of mercenary character who is specifically out to not just fight battles or whatnot, but specifically to hunt a bounty, was interesting. People liked that. I like that. And so that whole archetype just kind of grew throughout the extended universe. And then we come back around to episode 2, and Jango is basically that archetype personified. He is skilled and intelligent. He uses lots of different tools in order to modify him, a very Batman-y kind of perspective, a willingness to have different tools and a foresight to have different tools for different situations. And it's everywhere in his portrayal. The suit he wears, the devices he uses to fight Obi-Wan, the things he has on his ship, the way the ship works, etc., etc. All of that is very indicative of that. And one other thing I want to point out, a lot of people say Jango's pathetic because he loses to Obi-Wan. I think it's more like it's emphasized how good Jango is because he manages to hold off Obi-Wan. Whether or not Jango had orders to kill Obi-Wan or not is debatable. We don't actually know. But we do know that Palpatine overall wanted the Jedi to discover the plot on Geonosia. And so having Obi-Wan follow the trail, which was left here, in part thanks to the efforts of Jango, and then follow Jango to Geonosia is a very logical move. So keep in mind, it is very likely, and I don't remember if the Extended Universe expands on this, that Jango was under orders not to kill Obi-Wan, just give him a good fight and then lead him to Geonosia. That being said, Jango then died in about 5 seconds to Mace Windu, but I'll be discussing that later. Then there's Watto, because then we go to Anakin and his desire to help Shmi. Now, this is another thing, if I was rewriting this, I would make it a point. Remember, no bad dinner scene, no bad frolicking scene. Just have scenes that are showing, everything I mentioned before, her discipline, her refusal to admit how she's feeling, and his attempting to cope with his own conflicting emotions, right? And then have a scene where he has his dreams about his mother and cannot sleep. There's actually a good line in that scene where he says, "Please," she says she'll leave him alone. He says, "Please don't leave. Your presence is comforting or soothing," or something like that. That is very indicative of both their characters, and I like that, and it's a good line. And then his insistence that he has to go save Shmi, and Padme immediately agrees, and that's one of the few things they did right. They then immediately ruin it by having Anakin have another line which doesn't add anything to the scene, so chop that off. But otherwise, that was actually well constructed, even in my new rewritten version. Have her, despite all her discipline, despite all her duty, despite her no acknowledgement of the reality of the situation and what they have to do and all the responsibility that lies on them, say, "Yes, we will go help your mother immediately, let's go." Really shows a lot about both of their characters there. So then they meet Watto. I like Watto, believe it or not. It's kind of funny because he's very mercenary, as I mentioned before. One little tidbit that some people are not actually fully aware of: Watto actually deactivated the slave chip collar. He turned it off in Shmi. Now, in his own words, he did that because he was worried she would wander off in grief. or if you're missing it, that she would commit suicide, thanks to the collar. Whether that's indicative of him being a decent person or a horrible person is probably dependent on your perspective. We know she never actually did that. I think it's indicative of the fact that he is not truly an evil person. Like I mentioned back in episode 1, he is a mercenary, and he's not a good guy, but at no point does he reach over the level into cruelty. And his honest happiness at seeing Anakin really helped to flesh that out for me, and I just liked that. I just want to give more and more credit to the sound designers. The sound design in all of the Star Wars movies has always been top-notch. A lot of groundbreaking and industry standard establishing sound design going on in the Star Wars movies as a whole, going all the way back to A New Hope. But the sound design for the sonic charges that Jango uses in the asteroid field are really, really awesome. And I just feel like pointing that out. And then there's Christopher Lee. I'll be talking about Dooku more in a bit, towards the end of this video, and I'll be talking about him more in episode 3. But I just feel like pointing out that Christopher Lee is another example of a great actor adding weight to a character that might otherwise not have him. A lot of Count Dooku's lines, or Darth Tyrannus' lines, are kind of flat. But Christopher Lee manages to elevate that performance, in my perspective, to the point where he has that sophistication to him, and that presence, that charisma to him, that otherwise the lines on the paper kind of lack. So I like that. And then we have a scene where he traps the trade powers, the various merchant guilds and the bankers guild and the trade federation, all these different financial superpowers from the outer rims and the middle rim and the mid-rim. Mid-rim? I forget what that area is actually called. Anyways, he basically traps them. And it's a beautiful trap if you think about it. Because what he does, what Palpatine has arranged and Dooku enables, is they prey on the greed of these people. These people have been restricted by that same stagnation that is present in themselves. And I mentioned this back in episode 1, just as everyone else has. We can only do so much. And remember, the Trade Federation was so terrified because everything that they were doing wasn't legal. Remember that? And so all of these people have that same mentality. We want to legitimately do whatever we want. We want the benefits of power. We want to lavish in our wealth and our luxury and to do what we wish and to have riches and all the glory and all the women or men or whatever it is we want, maybe droids, I don't know. We want all of that. And so it's easy to prey on that particular type of greed. And this is why the trap is there, though, because that's not the trap. The trap is, once they are discovered, and once it's become obvious that this is a conflict, because everything they're talking about is basically enforcing a treaty that enables them to do whatever they want, to go through the courts, to go through the Senate, to legally claim their territory and their sovereignty, and then be able to do whatever they want. At no point were they actually planning to go to war, at least most of the people in charge weren't. But then they forced the hand because the entire point was that a war would start. And once a war has begun, once you have engaged in open insurgency through violence against the established power, there's no backing out at that point. You back out, and the best you can hope for is you lose everything you care about and wanted and might get to live through the experience. Think about that. The trap was beautiful because none of them really saw what they were getting into, and once they were into it, there was no getting out of it. Not with what they wanted intact. I'll mention this more later, but I just feel like mentioning the whole idea of Newt Gunray himself, who's desperate, who, as he's about to be cut down by Vader, he's like, "No, you don't understand. There was supposed to be peace. We were supposed to have treaty. We were supposed to, and then." Even then, even after the entire Clone War has been waged, they still wanted that legal perspective on things. Then Shmi dies. I don't have much to say about that scene except, wow. Another great example of Hayden Christensen's facial acting. And genuinely powerful. I actually found myself tearing up over it. Genuinely. Even after all, even after everything, even after rewatching this movie more than once, it was just, wow. And it's implied in the movie and stated explicitly in extended works that she was literally enduring the pain and torture and starvation that the Tusken Raiders were putting her through so that she could see him one last time. And that when she saw him, in her own words, she was complete. So she didn't have to hold on anymore. And so she died. And then Anakin's face. Another example of Hayden Christensen's facial acting. As he looks up and realizes, it's even before he exits the tent, as just raw, uncontrolled pain surges through him. It's not anger. What he is feeling is not anger. He is not feeling anything other than tremendous, insurmountable, unfathomable pain. And it is all right there on his face as everything just hardens into these concrete lines of just horror. And he takes that one tiny little step and kills them. In his own words, I killed them all, and the women, and the children too. His face as he shows his lack of understanding and his confusion about his own feelings, his horrifying his horror at his own actions, and again his comfortable nature with Padme. I'm not even sure he would actually be willing to talk about this with anyone other than the three people he trusts: Anakin himself, Padme, Obi-Wan, and Palpatine. And he is open and honest enough with her to express the true horror of what he has done. And yet some people have looked at that scene and said, well, he's not remorseful. Yes, he is. Look at him. Look at the way he's presenting himself. He is destroyed internally because he just murdered a bunch of people and he knows it. And yet he is conflicted because on the one hand, he's horrified, but on the other hand, he feels all that pain and anger, and he doesn't know how to coincide the two. He doesn't know how to make the two mesh. Because he never learned emotional control. Because he never gained emotional maturity. He was never given that chance. Wait, what? I can't read my own note here. Oh, right. Moving on. I also feel it would have been better if Anakin had shown shown better. It is debatably on screen. His being torn between what he should do, because he wants to go and save Obi-Wan, and it should have been much more obvious, I think, that he really wants to just leap out there and save Obi-Wan right now. He just lost his mother. The thought of losing his father, his brother, has got to be unbearable at that point in time. And it would have been awesome if he's like, no, I have to go, but I can't, because he also doesn't want to lose Padme. Remember, he's still supposed to be protecting her. They're still worried about the possibility of an assassination attempt on her. So the dilemma here is not whether or not he's going to follow his duty or not. The dilemma here for Anakin should have always been, I want to protect Obi-Wan, and I want to protect Padme, and I can't do both. And then it would have been Padme who actually steps in and offers the compromise. I'm going to go help Obi-Wan, and you have to protect me while doing it. Wouldn't that have made the structure of that scene and the significance of it much better? And again, this would be the second time we would have shown a insight into Padme's true feelings and caring about Anakin if we were doing my romantic rewrite. Because she obviously cares about Obi-Wan too, but the point is she is doing this for Anakin. She sees his torment and realizes that he is desperate not to lose someone else he loves. And so she steps in to solve his dilemma for him. And then Palpatine manipulates Jar Jar. Clearly the most difficult task ever. It's funny because upon rewatching the scene, I'm like, wow, they're laying it on really thick, aren't they? And it's pretty clear that the scene was scripted in character for Jar Jar's benefit. But it's funny because my first thought was, God, that's being so blunt and obvious and overt. I mean, it's like they're portraying it to some kind of idiot. And that's when the light dinged on. I was like, oh, right, okay, that's why they're doing that. And then, of course, let it never be said that George Lucas is not a crowd pleaser, because we find out that Jar Jar Binks is the cause of all the evil in the original Star Wars trilogy. Thank you, Jar Jar, you horrible, horrible bastard. Dooku then interrogates Obi-Wan, and he is beautiful in the way he is honest. he approaches Obi-Wan, and virtually everything he says, like 98% of what he says, that's an exaggeration, it's a lot, virtually everything he says is totally honest. Isn't that the best way to gain someone's confidence? To really get them on your side? To deceive them by being honest? And it's very indicative of Dooku's overall mentality. He is someone who is definitely all about trickery and cunning and careful manipulation and, you know, using his intellect as his best tool rather than the raw power of certain other people or the skill of certain others. He's just always manipulating the situation just quietly enough so that you're not even supposed to notice he's doing it at all. He's also, well, we'll talk about Dooku a little bit later. And then there's the Mega Man stage. Hey, let me go on record to say that another thing I don't dislike amongst this episode that a lot of people did was the Mega Man stage. I'm talking about the factory. For reference, if you ever watch that and turn it on to mute and turn on like Metal Man stage from Mega Man 2, it fits surprisingly well. But all seriousness being stated here, I didn't mind it. And as I was analyzing this, I was trying to figure out why that was, because I've heard a lot of complaints about the factory, video game stage before. And I think the reason why is, even though it was obviously choreographed to present a specific series of perils for our heroes, it never felt like that except for one or two times. For the most part, the way the conveyors worked, the way the machines were being constructed and put together, it all felt like the factory actually would be, regardless of if there was someone on the conveyor belt. And so I kind of was with it. In contrast to, Galaxy Quest, with that damned room that had the pistons that served no purpose whatsoever other than to be an obstacle for the protagonist to overcome. I felt like the conveyor belt was actually a thing in addition to being an obstacle for the people to overcome. That's just my take on it. And of course I am terribly stupid, but just my thoughts on it. And then there's R2-D2's rockets. I'll be honest, I actually thought it was pretty cool when R2-D2 took off in the rockets. In fact, I believe when I first saw this in the theaters, my reactions were in very short order. Oh, that's cool! Followed by, why has he never used those before? Or since, technically. I mean, the sense can be explained. At some point he lost the rockets. I mean, it's been quite a few years. Decades, I believe, between Episode 3 and Episode 4. But still, it's like, dude! But it doesn't bother me that much, so I only mention it as an anecdote. I will mention one other thing about R2-D2. He plays this same type of role in the original trilogy. R2-D2 is the perfect example of why you always want a hacker on your team. Seriously, think about it. How many times has he saved their bacon over and over and over in the original trilogy and in Episode 1, 2, and 3? And the reason why is because of all the various people who have all the skill and all the knowledge in engineering and mechanics and piloting and fighting and shooting, in sneaking, in subterfuge, in lying and diplomacy. R2's basically the only one who has any skill with computers. He actually fills a very crucial niche in their adventuring party, for lack of a better way to put it. And so it's pretty obvious to me one of the reasons why R2 became such a valued member of the team under certain circumstances, and one of the reasons why Anakin basically never refused to work with any other R2 droid other than R2 by the time Episode 3 rolls around. It's not hard to recognize the value there. And the other thing, which I'll talk about much later, they also played with expectations. For those of you who don't know what I mean, I have actually commented on this before, and a few people never even noticed this. Anakin's arm is caught in this conveyor, and it's his right arm. That's important. And it's caught in the thing, and he's in this big chopper thing, and eventually it's going to chop out, and it chops in just such a way that he manages to get his arm out, and, I've lost my lightsaber. But the point is, it was his right arm. Now, the right arm is the one we know Anakin lost. The right arm is the one we know that is replaced by a prosthetic because Darth Vader has his right arm replaced, and because Luke had that ironic significance of his own right hand being replaced. And so there was a lot of being played with expectations as he's trying to do that, because me and several other people always assumed that although Padme managed to get out unscathed from her particular death trap, Anakin would get out with, significantly less unscathed, and actually have to have bandages or whatnot put on him so that he could be executed properly, as he would be missing his hand for the final battle. And obviously that's not what happened. I just felt like mentioning it. And then we get the pre-arena scene. I already kind of talked about this extensively, and how I would have done it, and how great the reveal would have been if they'd done it properly. But one thing I want to give in the positive of this movie, because the lines are terrible. I truly, deeply, devotedly, wonderfully, significantly. I'm exaggerating. The lines are bad. The lines between the two of them are just bad, especially Padme's line. It's just, dude, get a consultant, you know? But, in defense of that scene, again, watch Hayden Christensen's face when she says that she loves him. Watch his shock and his confusion, and then the joy, which is immediately covered by fear and worry, and just all those emotions playing off his face in a few seconds. Good job, honestly. Then we have the circus execution. Now this, I feel, is another one of those beautiful examples of showing but not telling to establish a culture. The Geonosians laugh and cheer and are like, yeah, this is great, kill them all. Notice, especially if you pay attention, watch the scene again sometime, they cheer every time someone gets stabbed or killed or whatever. Now you're probably thinking, well, wait a minute, the three characters don't really get injured at all except for that one incident. Yes. Even when a Geonosian guard is out there and gets stabbed or eaten or trampled, everyone's like, yeah! I feel like that's very indicative of, shall we say, the bread and circuses, the Roman, the height of the Roman mentality there of the gladiatorial garbage, if I'm just going to say it bluntly, kind of culture that the Geonosians have, that desire to see that kind of blood sport, and which is combined with a tremendous amount of cowardice, because the Geonosians themselves rely on droids for the majority of their fighting just as much as the Neimoidians do, and when they fight in actual combat, well, let's just say that they're kind of treated as expendable. But I don't mean that this is the same mentality as the Neimoidians or culture, because actually I feel this is more leaning towards that insect mentality that we've already seen in their visual design. I also feel it extends to their cultural design. The only thing that matters in the insect hive are the individuals who have significant effect on the hive. In most cases, that's the queen. In this case, it's the head, what's-his-face, I can't even think of his name right now. But all the other lives are basically considered expendable compared to his, and anyone else who is of significance. And so I just think that that's the thing. In other words, it's not that we don't care about our own kind. It's not that we are necessarily... we value our lives more than the lives of our fellows. It's that none of our lives actually matter, and therefore that life being spent down there on that arena floor for our enjoyment is being well spent. And that's a crucial difference there, I feel. I also got to comment on two things. One, the midriff thing with Padme. God, that was contrived. That's all I'm going to say about it. I don't think this is necessarily a sexism thing, other than the desire to show off her abs, or waistline, or whatever. But it was so contrived, and it adds nothing, and it feels just kind of really stretched. I actually would have liked it better if she had been slashed, and then she just had these bloody tears, along her thing, rather than the whole midriff exposed. Just have these bloody tears going, and so it rather than looking sexy or good, it actually looks worse and shows how injured she is. I think that would have added to it better, especially given what I'm about to say. What we see from this scene until basically the end of the movie is Padme being very competent. She is on top of things, she is taking charge, she has no hesitation whatsoever about doing what is needed to do in order to try and ensure that she survives this situation in the best way possible. And that's shown before their captain saved by the Jedi and after. I mean, the fact that she was so close on the heels of the Jedi, given the fact that she fell out of the frickin' the frickin' fighter, is very indicative of her overall present. And it's kind of easy to see where Leia gets it from, if you see what I mean. I don't know how long I've been talking. We're on to page 4 now. I've kind of been blazing through this one. And then I have this note here. I'm just going to read this word for word. Behold! The moment in which Mace Windu becomes awesome. And it is, too. Before here, Mace Windu has basically done nothing and said nothing. Even his lines have been bad. I commented on that back in episode 1. Then he comes out, holds the lightsaber right to Jango's neck and says, nope. And the way he presents it is so Samuel L. Jackson. It's like they finally said, okay, go do your thing. And he was just like, ha 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 ha. And from this point on, Mace Windu is basically awesome. All the way up until, well, we'll talk about it more later. I also like, there's two big battles that finish off Attack of the Clones. Haha. The first is between the Jedi and the droids. The second is between the clone army and the droids. The first one, the good guys lose, and the second one, the good guys win. I'll be talking about that more in just a moment, but I like the fact that in that first battle, Padme and Anakin, God, even his name I tend to awe my A's, have some real genuine teamwork going on. And I liked just that casual, the fact that now that she has revealed the truth to him and he's revealed the truth to her, all that emotional distress that was between the two is gone, and now the two are just gelled together like two Tetris blocks, just plunk. I felt like that was really well done. The first battle is actually pretty darn good overall. It's actually very indicative of why the Clone Wars were necessary from Palpatine's perspective. Allow me to digress. First of all, the Jedi are so awfully and embarrassingly unprepared for combat that it's just all on display there. Let me explain what I mean by a bit. A Jedi by themselves is basically the ultimate warrior within this setting. I mean, there's very little that, as a classification, is stronger when it comes to combat. I know there's outliers and exceptions, but overall that's true. And yet the Jedi forces here lose. Tons of Jedi die, and they die to droids. Droids and fighter droids are basically the bottom rung of that thing. Now, yes, droids have their purpose, but droids, military droids, are combat droids are basically the very idea of quantity over quality. And even their so-called super battle droids are just slightly better than the existing ones. So the droids win literally by just swarming them in numbers until they defeat them, because the Jedi are unprepared for this kind of thing. At most, Jedi have learned combat by practicing in controlled, safe environments with other Jedi, or on occasion, those who have actually been out in and seen combat have been fighting people who are outnumbered, or who only outnumber them a little. Maybe 10 guys to 1 Jedi, and who are basically completely outmatched by the Jedi. Mass combat, an actual battle, in a war-type scenario, that is completely different. And anybody could know this theoretically, but I'm sure several of you out there, since I know I have a lot of military viewers out there, know what I mean by this. Especially studies of military history know what I mean by this. A battle is something completely different. And it becomes very obvious in the way this battle is unfolding that the Jedi are totally unprepared for this. So a lot of Jedi die. And then Dooku cuts off the assault for a moment, and he allows it to just kind of hang for a bit. I am not sure about the truth of this, but I would believe, without question, that Dooku, that Tyrannus, really should be more clear at this, had decided, was intentionally delaying his force's victory. How long did it take him to actually roll out the big, heavy firepower on that? In fact, he never actually unveiled the true army at his disposal. He just threw crap droids at them. And then the cavalry shows up, and then the droid armies start really going into full tilt. Because now we need to actually have a battle, so the clone army feels like they're actually going to win. Just indicative of its own thing there. Okay, what? Oh, right. I also want to point out that I don't really care for the 3PO scenes nearly as much as I do back in Episode 1. Most of them feel kind of tacked on and just kind of unnecessary. But I do have to admit, when he said, "Oh, this is such a drag," as he's being dragged along, that actually made me laugh, so kill me if you want. Mace Windu kills Jango Fett. For those of you who don't know, Windu is uses a Jedi form called Vapid, or Vapod. I'm not actually sure how to pronounce it. It's entirely designed to control the aggressiveness of both yourself and your opponent to your own benefit. It's one of the reasons why Mace Windu is one of the best Jedi as far as one-on-one combat in the Jedi Order. The only people who have really been able to match him are Dooku, and I think that's it, actually. It's also indicative because, and I'll talk about this much more in Episode 3, but Mace Windu is one of the very few Jedi who actually has a significant problem with the dark side. He uses, or rather is influenced, I should say, by the dark side much more than most Jedi, and he has developed his own form of discipline and self-control to move through that and use that darkness rather than his own thing. It's kind of funny, actually, because it means Mace Windu is leaning more towards gray than dark, but I'll get more into that later, like I said. But I'm just saying that all of that is very apparent in his scenes here. The way he presents himself, the way he fights in combat, and the way he just knocks Jango Fett down and just bam! chops his head off, one sweep, is very Mace Windu. Some people have complained that Jango Fett died so quickly and easily, but it shows the difference in perspective. Obi-Wan wanted to capture Jango Fett, and Jango did not want to kill Obi-Wan, and so the two basically danced. Obi-Wan also is not fully tested at that point in combat and uses Niman lightsaber form. I'll be talking about that much more in Episode 3. Niman is basically the most basic lightsaber form, by contrast. I think it's Form 1, I'm pretty sure, but anyways, I digress. Mace Windu uses Form 7, which he basically made his own style and gave it its own name. It had been used prior to his being around, but he's generally credited as the person who started that style. Is incredibly skilled, incredibly dedicated, and, again, was pretty much directly channeling the dark side. So, unlike Obi-Wan, Mace Windu came in there to kill Jango Fett, to kill him quickly, and to kill him as ruthlessly as possible, as absolutely as possible. Because that is the dark side in a nutshell, isn't it? The now, rather than the later. And he does. He just gets in there and FUNK! So I liked that scene. And it was also some interesting character development for Mace. So then we get into the second battle, which is much better than the first. In addition to the cavalry effect that was going on, what we have now is a true battle. Before, the inexperience and general lack of competency on behalf of the Jedi was being overmatched by the sheer numbers of the significantly, inexperienced, not really particularly useful droids. In the second battle, we have skilled fighting machines, that would be the clones, who have armor and armament who are willing to pull it fully to bear. And on the other side of the droids, they finally unleash the full might of their empire, vehicles and heavy droids, etc., that it had at its disposal. So it goes from being like this battle to being more like this battle, and the clones do win that one out. But part of that is because of the sheer nature of the surprise attack that they were able to make. I mean, God's sakes. But it's also very significant because this battle shows why the Clone Wars were so beautifully devastating. Let me lay this out for you. This battle showed the Jedi, specifically, and the Republic overall, who would take the advice of the Jedi, that the Clone Army was absolutely required. The Clone Army took a disorganized and defeated mess into a victory. Yes, I'm quoting KOTOR on purpose here. The Clone Army was something that was absolutely required and essential, even if the Jedi disagreed with it, and several of them did. There was no denying that they would now accept the Clone Army. Now think about how significant that is. Up until that moment, up until that battle, it would be very easy for the Jedi and the Republic to not want to use the Clone Army. Yes, I know the Republic had ratified the usage of the Clone Army and blah, blah, blah. And yes, it had become legal, but there was still the possibility of them disagreeing with that or refusing, and this is very important, the Jedi themselves refusing to get involved in the war directly. And yet what they see in this battle is the requirement, the need for them to get involved directly, the need for them to be a part of this fighting force, to direct it and guide it, and how only through this force, and only through our intervention in this force, can we have victory. After all, the Jedi Order are supposed to be protectors of the Republic, right? Like I said, by going to war at all, the Jedi lost. I also like the fact that Yoda and Mace Windu both naturally move into their roles in a military doctrine, in a military hierarchy. Yoda immediately goes to the command center to take charge. Mace Windu immediately gets his own special elite commandos to go to the front lines and start chopping the crap out of things. Very indicative of their respective personalities right there. Nice little tidbit, doesn't have to be fleshed out too much. And the overall, I just have this note. I mentioned before and I mentioned again, George Lucas does some damn good directing when it comes to certain types of directing. And this battle is a great example of that. The direction on this battle is top-notch. It really gets across the feeling of just how chaotic and brutal and wide-scale it is. And it's awesome. He's not that good at the personal characterization stuff. I've talked about that before. It's one of the reasons why he actually has always done such good work when he pairs himself with Steven Spielberg, who is really good at directing personal and character, moments and really, pulling out that pathos out of a scene. But I digress. And then they show the Death Star. I know. it can be explained that the extended universe story about how the Death Star was designed and built, and the episode 2 and 3 story about how the Death Star was built can be retconned into fitting with each other. But I always felt that adding that little twist at the end there was completely unnecessary in episode 2, and it's just bugged me ever since. And that's all. I just feel like mentioning that. Just a little note. Then we have a great argument between Anakin and Obi-Wan. It once again, it shows Obi-Wan's perspective once again, that humility. It would be too obvious, and indeed I feel like most Jedi would have been confident in their ability to stop Dooku, but Obi-Wan does not have that. He does not have that arrogance. His line to Anakin, which resonated most with me, which was, "I need you. I need you." Now I could try to really extrapolate on that if I wanted to. And I kind of do, because I get the hint that it's not just, I need you to do this because I know I can't do it alone. It's, I need you because I need you at my side. I need the one Jedi in all of everywhere that I trust to be right next to me in battle, and that's you, Anakin. And Anakin is looking at one of the people he cares about most, and the horror of possibly losing her. Remember, this is not even a few days after his mother died. So think about, well, okay, there's transit time and light speed, so we're not actually sure how many time, but it has not been long. At the absolute most, it couldn't be more than a month. So, yeah, that wound is still fresh for him, and to see that loss has to be crushing him. And the one thing that finally gets him to agree to go ahead and go with Obi-Wan is not just the "I need you," although that stalls him, you notice. He looked like he was about ready to jump out himself, but it's Obi-Wan's "I need you" stalls him, and then Obi-Wan says, "What would she do?" And he realizes the truth, that Padme would, do her duty, do the mission. He doesn't like it, but he starts to accept it. It's the very first time we get to see Anakin Skywalker grow. Just a little bit. Just a tiny little bit of that growth. And for once, it happens not in a confined or isolated area with a velvet prison or fear or doctrine. It happens because in the moment, right now, we need to do the right thing, even if it's not what you want to do. It's one of the reasons why Anakin grows so much between episode 2 and 3. Because of the Clone Wars. Because he has all that adversity to overcome. Because he finally goes through all this terrible, horrible stuff with his friend, with his brother, Obi-Wan, and grows in his relationship with Padme. And by the time episode 3 rolls around, he's actually a person who has become, I would actually argue, an adult, instead of the kid he's been up to this point in time. Beautiful. Beautiful little tidbit there, and very necessary, I think. If they had not shown that first step towards his emotional growth as an adult, it would have cheapened what happens in episode 3. I mean, we could still extrapolate it, but would have lessened it. But its presence makes all the more difference, because now we can see where that first step... I mean, you show the first step and the last step of a journey, the journey will have more significance. You follow? It's also really obvious that this is Jedi's very first Jedi duel. Because he's pathetic, to just put it bluntly. I'm going to go ahead and mention something really quick before I really start talking about Dooku. I have a whole paragraph basically here about Dooku. Dooku uses... I wrote it down. Makashi lightsaber form, okay? For those of you who don't know what that means, Makashi is basically designed to be used to use the Force and to be used against someone else who is using the Force and using a lightsaber. In other words, it was specifically developed by the Jedi to fight the Sith and vice versa. It was lightsaber versus lightsaber combat. Now, Dooku, back when he was actually a Jedi, who was actually a Padawan, championed Makashi to the point of exclusiveness. I'll talk about that more in just a little bit, and how it relates to his character. But the point is, he's damned good at fighting other Jedi. Anakin and Obi-Wan have never actually fought another Jedi for real. Another Force user, I should say, with the sole exception of when Obi-Wan fought Darth Maul. And Maul had a completely different approach to that. Maul was using, I forgot to write it down, but he's using another style, which is pretty much designed to be aggressive Force, aggressive use of tactics in order to, you leave yourself open a lot, but you are much more capable of getting in blows on the other person. For those of you who don't know, the various Jedi lightsaber forms of combat are based on real-life sword fighting techniques, which is one of the reasons why I know about them, and because I myself have done sword fighting and taught sword fighting in my life. It's fascinating stuff. I love it. Anyways, But that's significant because Anakin goes into there as an obvious amateur. Lots of power, lots of raw skill, but completely untamed. And Dooku just crushes him. Then Obi-Wan goes in, and now this is interesting because, well, okay, I'm kind of digressing a little bit because I'm getting this a little bit out of hand. Anakin rushes and pays for it. Obi-Wan tries to approach him, absorbs the lightning, I'm not even going to comment on how stupid that is, and then duels him and is so overwhelmed. Because Obi-Wan is not prepared to fight someone who is fighting completely with their cunning and their skill. Dooku literally is playing with Obi-Wan. Obi-Wan doesn't even present a challenge to Dooku. He plays with him to the point where he literally does the fencing thing. First blood, second blood, down you go. You know, the little scars he gives him on his arm and his leg, just to put him down, just to hamstring him, kind of literally. That's it. That's all that's necessary. I win. And then Anakin comes in, and Anakin starts fighting him a little bit more for real. I'd like to take a brief aside to say that I really wish we saw more of the dual wielding. For those of you not aware, in the history of Star Wars up to this point, we have basically not ever seen on the big screen, we have never seen on the big screen dual-wielded lightsaber combat. And a lot of people were like, oh yeah, that's awesome! It lasts like 5 seconds. I really wish we could have seen more of that. I really do. I understand why they didn't. They were having huge issues with the choreography, and it was literally causing the choreographers to basically tear their hair out, setting that scene up. Because remember, that's actually not Christopher Lee there, so this effects team also has to touch up every single scene with him in a duel, and then they have to choreograph it with someone who's constantly trying to... It was a mess. So I see why they did it. It's just, it would have been nice. They made that up later, but I digress. So Anakin then goes after them, and Anakin loses. But here's the significant part. Anakin pushes him, because by this point Anakin starts to draw on the dark side just a little bit, and starts to really approach this like it's serious. Again, his first approach was that arrogance, that overconfidence, that I'm a Jedi and I'm just going to win. And for his answer to that, he gets blasted by lightning and shoved up against the wall. Completely pulled out of the fight, or at least theoretically. In his second fight, he approaches Dooku as a dangerous adversary, and actually tries. And he pushes Dooku. Now, he loses badly. He literally loses his arm. That's when he loses his arm, by the way. Yeah, anyways, I'm not going to comment on the continuity thing you're expecting me to comment on. But suffice it to say, he loses his arm and then is disarmed and out of the fight. But afterwards, there's this wonderful scene, tiny, subtle, very required. It shows Dooku... You know, before he was laughing and playing and just whatever with Obi-Wan. After Anakin, you can tell he's actually thankful that he got through that alive, that he was not prepared to have to fight that hard, and he was surprised at the strength Anakin came after him that second time. Then Yoda shows up. I'm going to talk about the Yoda thing right now, really quick. Yoda shows the perfect demonstration of Ataru lightsaber form. In the books, it's literally written as he was in the air more than he was on the ground. And Ataru is all about trying to overcome your literal physical deficiencies by using them as an asset. Yoda is short and small and not very strong, so he uses his mobility and skill with the Force to literally become an acrobatic fighter. And it's also worth noting that Yoda did not want to kill Dooku, whereas it's entirely possible that Obi-Wan and Anakin before wanted to, at the very least, cause him significant grievous injury. But Yoda was basically just forcing him to a standstill. At no point in time did Dooku actually gain the advantage, even though Yoda pretty clearly had him outclassed. The only thing that Dooku could do was to literally threaten the lives of the other two Jedi to flee. And that's a perfect demonstration of Yoda's mindset. The duel itself, I'll talk about that in a moment, and the saving of the hostages at the expense of letting the bad guy get away. But then the final note, after the duel is finished, after he has completed his actions, well, I'll go into this in full detail. First, Dooku comes at him with the Force. Yoda just counters that, barely even tries. And then Dooku comes at him with lightning, and Yoda's like, no, that's not going to work either. And then Dooku pulls out his lightsaber. Now, Yoda knows Dooku. Dooku was his Padawan. I know there's some conflicting reports about that, just bear with me. And Yoda knows Dooku is the basically best duelist of all the Jedi. So Yoda knows immediately, before he even pulls his lightsaber out, he needs to try. And so Yoda pulls out his saber, drops his walking stick, and goes berserk. Absolutely just basically owning the hell out of Dooku for all intents and purposes. Probably could have killed him pretty quickly, I think, if he was actually caring to do so. And then, of course, save the hostages. But this is the most important part. After the thing, he puts away his lightsaber, brings back his walking stick, and goes back to hobbling. Now, that was an obvious moment of awesome. I distinctly remember the audience laughing in the theater when he did that. But it always resonated with me because that is Yoda. He has ridiculous levels of raw power and a tremendous skill and knowledge and wisdom in it. But he only uses it when he feels he has to. He could fly around, literally, with the Force if he wanted to. He could careen himself on storm fronts of lightning with the kind of power he has. But he uses a simple walking stick and walks along because he doesn't need to use that power. He doesn't need to demonstrate his power. He doesn't need to exert himself just for his own aggrandizement. He can get along just fine with his little walking stick. When he needs to use that power, he can and will, and does. But there's no need to... He's actually, ironically, trying to counter his own weakness in so doing so. Trying to counter his own arrogance, knowingly or not, with humility. But I know what you're expecting me to say. The Yoda fight scene, because I kind of skipped over that, didn't I? I remember being in the theater when this movie came out. Midnight showing. And I remember Yoda drops the staff, Force grabs his lightsaber out of the thing and lights it, and then goes to town on Dooku. I actually couldn't hear the next 10 or 20 seconds of audio from the movie because the audience was cheering like a thunderous roar because it was awesome! Excuse me, I know you guys don't like it when I raise my voice, but it was! I know some people think it's silly, I know some people think it's ridiculous, but it was awesome for many reasons. Number one, it's just kind of cool. It just has its own cool factor. Number two, that kind of acrobatic combat is very fun to watch because it's so difficult to pull off in real life. Real people can do what is effectively the Ataru fighting style in real life. I can't anymore because of my leg, but I used to do it. Not good, I'll be honest, but I used to be able to do it. But the point is, in addition to all these things, it's really showing us for the first time Yoda unleashing himself. The Yoda we always knew was always quiet and only used power to the tiniest extent he could. He pulled the X-Wing out of the thing and did so casually, but he did so because that wasn't an exertion for him. Not really. It wasn't something that was hard. This was us getting to see Yoda really unleash for just a few brief moments, so we could really see what he was capable of in his prime, when he was still when he wasn't hiding on a rock using the life force of a few trillion animals in order to hide his existence. You follow? It was really awesome to see Yoda unleash like that, which is funny. Remember what I said about that Yoda unleashing. Remember that. It'll be important next week. Two last notes. I wonder how long I've been talking. My throat hurts again. Count Dooku. I told you I'd talk about him. This is probably the best moment to talk about him because he doesn't have that much of a role in the movies despite being absolutely critical to the plot, to the setting, to several of the character developments. Dooku is exactly what would happen if a genuinely caring person who wants to do good, I should say, not caring, someone who wants to accomplish, joined the Jedi Order under these circumstances. It's kind of ironic because in several ways he is like Anakin, except, much further down his path. He left the Jedi Order because he believed the Jedi Order had failed. It was incapable of accomplishing anything. And he was right. He was also courted by Plagueis and by Palpatine, I might add, but I don't want to get too much into that. The point is, he was someone who was brilliant, someone who was ridiculously skilled in the Force, someone who was very powerful skilled in the Force, someone who was incredible with a lightsaber, someone who had tremendous charisma, and was very intelligent. He was everything that the Jedi Order would have championed and wanted to be their greatest example of a Jedi, and yet, at all times, he chafed against the Order's rules and limitations and restrictions, which they did not understand. The only one I feel who ever actually reached him was probably Yoda himself, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. But the other interesting thing about Dooku is, those of you who don't know, he was actually from a wealthy house. So he had, by inheritance and right, a great deal of wealth and power that could be his if he chose it. That's one of the reasons they call him Count Dooku. There is an actual power behind that title in his case. And all of those things, the wealth, the influence, the power, the skill, the knowledge, the desire to do, all made him the perfect puzzle piece for Palpatine. Tyrannus, Dooku, whatever you want to call him, is an irony because he is by his nature something that is incredibly valuable to Palpatine and yet has to be disposed of. Because there's no denying whatsoever, and the books confirm this absolutely, that Tyrannus/Dooku was eventually going to take over and usurp Palpatine. Remember, Palpatine doesn't really agree with the rule of two, not in the way that other Sith have. I would argue Palpatine isn't actually a Sith either, but I'm getting off the point. The point is, he always believed in the rule of two, as in, I'm going to be in charge, and there's always going to be one other Sith, and that's it. We will have a monopoly on the Jedi, and that's the end of it. Dooku was never going to be his partner. Dooku was never going to be his apprentice, his enforcer. Because that's not what Dooku is he? He is the same kind of person Palpatine is, a leader, a ruler, someone who wants to rule. Because if you think about it, both Palpatine and Dooku have that similarity. They are not particularly interested in the benefits of rule, like so many of the Trade Federation people were I mentioned earlier. They want those luxuries, they want those rights, they want those romantic entanglements and the comforts and all those fine foods and drink. They wanted the benefits of rule. But both Tyrannus and Palpatine wanted to rule. They wanted to be the ones in charge to do things the way that they felt things should be done. And both people disagreed with how that should be done, I might add. It's one of the reasons Palpatine, though, was so successful in recruiting Dooku, because they both had that same generalized ideology. The galaxy is a rotting mess, and we need to fix it. Think about that. Now, he goes down the dark path in his own particular way, but one other interesting thing about him, he is pretty much I mentioned earlier he studied Makashi, which is to be used against other Force users. That itself explains his personality in so many ways. He always wanted to be the best, basically, the best at a thing. He actually personally espoused the idea that only someone who really perfected one form, one art of their usage of skill, whether it be a lightsaber form or through the Force, could become truly a master. Whereas someone who tried to be proficient in multiple forms, which is what most Jedi do, would suffer as a result of that. He also reportedly had a great deal of respect for Windu and a tremendous amount of respect for Yoda as a result of this philosophy as well. There's a scene. It's part of a book. Forgive me, I don't remember the name of the book. Yoda and Dooku contact each other. Now this is a beautiful piece because Yoda actually informs the Jedi Council and Palpatine about the fact that Dooku wants to meet with him. It's indicative because remember all the way back at the beginning of this video I mentioned how Palpatine had the ear of the Council and how significant that was. Of all the people Yoda could have told, he told the Council and he told Palpatine. So Sidious contacts Dooku and says, "What the hell?" And Dooku says, "No, I'm luring him into a trap." And so Palpatine realizes the threat he is being possessed with, because there is only one thing that could have actually pulled Dooku from his grasp, and that is, ironically, a genuine arm of forgiving friendship. And that's exactly what Yoda offers him. Genuinely. Yoda goes to meet Dooku, not to fight him, not to bring him down, not to argue philosophy or politics. He goes to Dooku and says, "I'm sorry. Come back." I believe one of the exact quotes is, "You will find more forgiveness of your old master, himself, than of your new." And Dooku genuinely considers it. And I find myself wondering how awesome it would have been if Dooku had taken that offer. If he had been one of the Jedi to die fighting against Anakin and the Purge, instead of what ended up happening, dying fighting Anakin. But it doesn't happen. He doesn't turn. The reason he doesn't come back is because Palpatine. Palpatine engineers a situation so that it appears to Dooku that Yoda has betrayed him when Yoda has not. And so Dooku basically never actually recovers from that incident. But that incident shows that Dooku does have a degree of attachment, not necessarily to his old life, not to the Order, but to the things that actually mattered to him. Getting something done, actual caring about certain individuals, and Yoda himself. It's kind of a pity, really, because Dooku was always disposable, and I don't think he ever saw that. I think Dooku always assumed that he was going to take control from Palpatine, because Palpatine had none of what he had. The wealth, the influence, the charisma, the grand facade, and the leadership of an entire army. And all Palpatine was a politician who had a few people he could pull string-wise. It kind of shows who was the competent manipulator in the end, doesn't it? Very final note. Very final note. I wish... I don't remember the exact ruling on this because I've heard conflicting reports, but it's believed that the movie was supposed to end on the scene with the Clone War beginning, with all the troops marching onto the ships as the Imperial March rises in the background and we see Palpatine looking out at the Grand Army of the Republic. And it would have been awesome if the movie had ended on that note, in my opinion. But it was believed it was too dark. Again, this is kind of hearsay. And it was theorized that it was believed to be too dark, and so they ended it on the wedding scene instead to have the ending end on a happier note. I found myself wondering at that. Episode 2, as I mentioned way back, right here actually, it's actually my very first note on the top of the page, is much darker than Episode 1, and it should be. The middle work in a trilogy tends to be the dark one. Empire Strikes Back itself is one of the movies that kind of pioneered that cinematic concept, that trope. Ending it on a light note wouldn't have worked, in my opinion, if that's indeed what they wanted to do, but the great and beautiful irony is that on retrospect, they didn't end it on a positive note. They show visually and audibly it goes from dark and foreboding to light and happy, and yet at the same time, if you're really thinking about it, the tone never shifts from that foreboding sense of dread. In the former, it's obvious. Palpatine and the Republic have formed a massive army. Fleets, troops, personnel, supplies, they are gearing for war. And then it switches to Anakin, who already has one artificial limb, and is solidifying his bond officially, well, quietly, but he is fully joined now with Padme, and the two of them are together, and we all know what that's going to lead to, don't we? Beware the dark side, indeed.